All right, guys, Mr. D. Here we go again. I'm going to start making these videos again. For a minute, I was starting to think that I wasn't going to make these YouTube videos of me teaching anymore because so many of you are not watching these videos. The last couple of videos, I've only gotten like 20-something views. However, some of the students have reached out to me and said that those videos are very helpful. So I'm going to continue to make them. In an effort to make sure that you guys all watch these videos, I'm going to start embedding questions into these videos, all right? And I'll have you respond to me on Google Docs, the answers to these questions. The reason I know all of you aren't watching them is because I only have like 23 views, and I have almost 80 students, so I'm going to be checking that, right? So if I only have 20 views, but I get 80 responses, 80 answers to all the questions, and that means that we just shared answers. We didn't really watch the video, so I just won't give anyone credit, right? So watch the videos. I'm taking my time to make them. Please take your time to watch them. It's really not that much work. All right, so what we've been looking at, I've given you a few videos, a few of those ed puzzles, things to kind of give you guys this big, broad idea of evolution, okay? And now we're going to start breaking it down into pieces. All right, so evolution is a change in a species over time, right? In a minute, we're going to define species just to make sure we know exactly what we're talking about. But how? How does this change happen, right? What causes it? So far, everything that you guys looked at has been this idea of natural selection, right? So this is when an organism has some sort of mutation, and that mutation just helps it to be a little bit better dealing with its environment, right? So the one example is the giraffe with the long neck. Some giraffe, there was a mutation, the giraffe had a longer neck. It was able to reach more food, it lived longer, it had more offspring, it passed on the long neck trait to its offspring, right? So it worked out, right? It gave it some sort of advantage. The other thing here is artificial selection, right? So we know species change over time because of things that we did, right? So your first question is, give me the differences between natural selection and artificial selection. First question. All right. I'm going to give you guys an example of artificial selection. Second question is, you give me an example of artificial selection. So the one I'm going to give you is dogs, right? Most people have dogs. But dogs all started out as wolves, right? But we artificially selected certain traits and wound up breeding these dogs to wind up with all the different types of dogs that we have, right? We have really big dogs. You're about to see a picture of mine. We have really small dogs. We have cute dogs. We have dogs that help us herd cattle. We have dogs that help us alert people that have diabetes that their blood sugar is too high or too low. We have dogs that can smell cancer in a patient. We have dogs that help the police find bombs and drugs and things like that. So we bred and selected all of these traits that we wanted in these dogs, and we've artificially selected those traits, right? So that's artificial selection. So there's natural selection, which comes from a mutation. There's artificial selection, which is something that we select for and breed to get more of that trait, okay? Sit. All right, guys, that's little man, all right? All right, guys, so I told you I was going to tell you what exactly is a species, right? So a species is a group of organisms that interbreed. That means they exchange genes. We learned about meiosis, right? We learned that we get half of our genes from mom and half of our genes from dad, right? Half of the genes wind up in a sperm, half of the genes wind up in an egg, right? And those two things come together, and then you have all the genes that you need for the new organism, right? So to be the same species, you have to be able to interbreed and exchange genes, right? But that's not the only thing. You also have to produce fertile offspring, okay? So the classic example is a horse and a donkey can interbreed, but the product that they produce is a mule, and mules are sterile, right? So mules are not fertile offspring. Mules cannot produce their own young, right? So mules are just this interbreeding of two animals that are not the same species. right? So there are a few examples where that can happen. So to be the same species one more time, you have to be a group of organisms that interbreed, exchange genes, and produce fertile offspring. Okay? All right. So then when we talk about evolution, if we want to like go way back in time, we think to ourselves, well, how did we wind up with all of these different species of organisms, plants and animals and everything else, right? Well, we have this process called speciation, right? That's the formation of a new distinct species, right? So something that was the same species somehow branches, right, and becomes a different species, right? So if we were to kind of look at it, right, this blue line would be the timeline of this one species, right? And then at some point, something happens, right, where we're going to talk about the things that could possibly happen. But this blue species continues, right? But whatever happened here, right, at this point, we wind up with another species, right? And we're going to talk about what can cause this speciation, how this can happen, all right? All right, guys. So I said we're going to talk about speciation, right, and how it happens, right? We talked about this timeline, right? We have the same species all the way through, and at some point, something causes this species to branch away from one another, and these organisms that were all the same start to become something different, right? All right. So it doesn't happen instantly. It happens over time, right? When this break originally happens, they're probably still able to interbreed, but for some reason they don't interbreed. And over a long enough time of being apart, they're no longer able to interbreed. All right? So there's these 5 different types of isolation, right? So that's things that will create a barrier between those organisms interbreeding, okay? All right, so ecological, right? That would be like a certain habitat, right? So maybe an organism that normally lives on the ground, say some sort of bug or something that lives on the ground, some of those organisms develop wings that allow it to fly, right? Or develop a better way to climb up a tree, right? And they start finding food in that tree, right? So they're going to start having offspring, more offspring. They're going to live longer. And now these organisms all live in the trees while those other ones still live on the ground, right? And we wind up with these 2 different populations, and then eventually they become their own species, right? If that stays long enough where these guys stay in the trees and those guys stay on the ground, right? Temporal, right? So temporal means that's when those organisms mate, right? So there's lots of organisms that only mate during a certain time of year or a certain time of day, whether it's night or day or morning or whatever. So for whatever reason, these organisms can change when they mate, right? For some reason, right? And then if that mating ritual, stays apart long enough, well, then those organisms over a long enough period of time will become different species, right? Behavioral. Behavioral is, I always think of fish or birds. So birds, right? Lots of birds do these different dances or calls that will attract the mate, right? And if that call's a little bit off or that dance is a little bit off, then that mate the female doesn't want to mate with them, right? The crazy thing about behavioral is interesting because usually when we think about these changes, we say, well, that organism is going to be better suited to live in its environment because of this change, right? If not, it's going to die off. But that's not always the case. With this behavioral, these mating rituals, there are actually some birds that have developed solid wings because what they do is they bang their wings together. It's part of their mating ritual. And the females have basically selected for the males that have these solid wings. Whatever that sound is with the solid wings when they bang them together, that's more enticing to the female, right? So those solid wings make those males a little bit slower flyers, so they're not quite as good at catching prey. They're not quite as good at getting away from predators. However, the females like it. So that is actually the predominant bird of that species. They have these solid bones in their wings, and when they click them together, that entices the female to mate, right? So they have more offspring because of that trait, right? So different mating rituals, different calls could change over time. Maybe, this group of females of this one particular species of bird really likes this call that this other bird is doing. They mate. Over time, that call gets passed on to the offspring, and over a long enough period of time, they're no longer able to interbreed, and we wind up with a different species. Mechanical, right? So the one example that I have here is the shape of a flower. Well, say there's lots of different pollinators, right? There's bees and there's birds and there's wind and there's lots of things that could change the way something is pollinated, right? So if we have some sort of plant, right, and there's a mutation and that flower shape changes a little bit, and maybe the predominant way that that plant spread its pollen was from the wind, right? And the wind spread the pollen from one flower to the next, right, and fertilized that flower. However, that shape of the flower was maybe a cup or something, and the wind would blow and it didn't really blow the pollen out of that flower, right? But maybe some sort of bee or insect liked that flower, wanted to hide in that flower, whatever it is, right? And then pass that trait on to more flowers, right? And then, because it was in that flower, it was in another flower, and then pass that trait on. So now we wind up with this plant that has other flowers, like these smaller flowers that pollen's not passed by the wind, but it's passed by this insect, right? So now this insect is probably going to also change a little bit, right? And because it found this little place where it likes to hide, right? So that mechanical, right? That's a change that can cause this speciation. Geographical is another one. Physical barriers, right? So there could be some sort of physical barrier that could arise and cause organisms to speciate, right? So we don't always want to think of animals, right? We can think of plants as well. Say something happened. We had some major flooding and we wound up with this new offshoot of a river, right? So this river starts cutting through this area. It used to have this one grass that grew all over the place, right? But this river now cut through that area where this grass grew. So now the grass on either side may no longer be able to interbreed, spread its pollen back and forth. So the grass on this side could turn into a different species than the grass on that side. Things like earthquakes and tectonic plate movement and things like that are all physical barriers that could arise and cause organisms that once they're left alone by themselves for a long enough period of time, they wind up becoming different organisms because of their own mutations over time within that population, right? So populations can also, like we're saying, that same population can change, right? So we know the one thing that Darwin saw was in the Galapagos, he saw these finches. These finches have all different beaks, and their beaks are very specific to the type of food that they eat, right? So some beaks are big and strong, they're good for cracking nuts, where other beaks are long and skinny, and they're good for sticking their beaks into small holes in like a tree and getting insects out, right? So they're all finches, right? But they all, over time, on their own little islands with the food source that's available to them, evolved these different beak sizes or these beak shapes, right? That were better suited to that area. All right. The other thing that we can see sometimes is we might see a mutation that happens and causes these organisms to kind of separate a little bit. Sometimes, though, those two organisms could actually, because in the beginning, they're still able to interbreed, right? So if they start interbreeding, right, we could wind up with a species that they all just come back to being the same species, but they have this new mutation. Or they could wind up becoming three different species, right? We could have this hybrid species, this one in the middle, right, that is different than both of those and winds up becoming its own species. That one stays whatever it was originally. This one becomes its own thing, right? And sometimes maybe this species is now more viable than that species, and that species gets wiped out and we don't even see it anymore, right? So this is how we wind up with different species. So for your assignment, what I want you to do is, I want you to give me your own example of each one of these types of isolation. All right? So that is your assignment for today, right? Answer all the questions in the video. Thank you.